Are you having a hard time figuring out what to get Dad for Father's Day? Shop now at sportshistorynetwork.com/row1 and save 15% off your order when you check out Row 1 Brand's Vintage Sports Pictorium Gallery. They have America's best sports art. With over 7,200 historic sports prints, you're assured to find something unique for Dad this Father's Day. If he's an NFL buff, check out the 1963 vintage NFL helmet poster. Shop now at sportshistorynetwork.com/row1.
This podcast is part of the Sports History Network, your headquarters for the yesteryear of your favorite sport. You can learn more at sportshistorynetwork.com.
Hello, old sports. Welcome back to the Hello, Old Sports podcast here on the Sports History Network. We would like to thank you for once again joining us into our weekly journey into the history of sports. Really can be anything from 1890s baseball to Super Bowl 25 to the early days of the NBA. You name it, we cover it here on Hello Old Sports. And as you will know, if you listen to the past couple of episodes, Andrew and I are devoting some time to our alma maters, or at least two of our alma maters. We did a couple episodes recently about LaSalle basketball. We had Mr. Grzybowski on to talk about his excellent Tom Gola book, and basketball is not really our thing at my alma mater at Boston University, so we've decided to talk about a sport that we haven't talked a lot about so far here on Hello Old Sports, and that is the sport of ice hockey. So we're going to talk a little bit about Boston University hockey for the next hour or so. Andrew, how are you doing today?
I'm doing well. Like you mentioned, we did an episode or two on the history of my alma mater, the LaSalle University Explorers. Well, we also talked about when LaSalle College became LaSalle University, probably for longer than we should have. That was good. So now we're returning the favor. And as we have discussed previously, I will wait for the next go round before we get into my other alma mater, the John Jay High School football team. And I will mostly spend the time railing against the absurd call that went against us in 10th grade against Arlington in 2001. But we'll hold off on that for at least another couple of weeks, although you've already promised me that we can do several episodes on this.
I've said no such thing. But before we start, just
because the play was over already. Anyway, sorry, go ahead.
Was this penalty on you?
No, I was on the sideline. It was on our kickoff team.
So before we begin, just the normal entreaties to please like us on Facebook, Hello Old Sports Podcast. Email us if you have any questions or show ideas or anything like that, hellooldsports@gmail.com. Follow us on iTunes or your podcast app of choice. Give us a nice 5-star rating. Tell us what you like. All of that good stuff. Please just find whatever way you can to engage with the show. And if you have any energy left over after you do that, check out the rest of the great shows on the the rest of the great shows on the Sports History Network podcast network at sportshistorynetwork.com. Andrew and I have guested on a number of shows recently, specifically Darren Hayes' show, Pigskin Dispatch. We've done some episodes about the greatest football players to wear one number or another. So as you will know, if you've listened to the show for any period of time, Andrew and I are both born and bred New Yorkers. And so that makes us sort of, I guess, somewhat, maybe a little bit, even though I'm an alumni, that makes us a little bit unqualified to talk about hockey in Boston and in New England. And so in order to supplement the episode today, we thought we'd bring in another New Yorker, because why not? So my good friend and college, I wouldn't say classmate, because I was a year ahead of her, but my good friend and fellow New Yorker, but also a fellow Boston University alum, is Janine Schatz. Janine, thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Thank you, guys. Good to be here. Weird to be inside the machine.
So Janine has been good enough to take some time out of her schedule to talk to us about one of her great loves, Boston University hockey. And so why don't you tell us a little bit, because you sort of have a background as sort of on both sides of the glass, so to speak. So tell us a little bit about your time at BU and your experience with BU hockey.
Sure. I mean, it may make sense to start like a few years before I even thought to apply to BU, when the Islanders drafted Rick DiPietro, who went to Boston University for a year. And I was like, oh, okay. I hadn't really been thinking about college yet, and I was like, oh, BU, interesting. Hockey, okay. That was really the first, like, it came up on my radar. And then once I learned more about BU, I urban campus, like you could pick any major you wanted. Boston's a great city. I was on board and I enjoyed it. And then after, it was the only school I ever really wanted to go to. And one of the perks that I also identified was that it had a thriving, robust women's club hockey team. Because I started playing ice hockey in the beginning of high school. And so I was not going to be on like a D1 or D3 college roster. But, the idea of some place where I could still play on a women's team was intriguing, as well as knowing that the men's team was like the main sport on campus, since we didn't have football. That once that came up, that like basically sealed the deal for me. So as you said, I went to BU not only as a fan of the thriving men's team, but also I got to play as well.
It's funny you mention the DiPietro thing, because I sort of have my own little story about that, and mine is much more coincidental. He was drafted in the 2000 NHL draft, which was like the third week of June, as the draft is always around then, I would imagine. I know.
Yep.
And
I thought you were asking if the hockey draft was around in 2000.
well, hey, they didn't have a baseball draft until like sometime in the 60s. So my parents and I took a trip up to Boston right after the school year ended for me, right after my junior year ended. And as we tended to do on long car trips, much to my mother's chagrin, we would listen to WFAN all the way up to to wherever it was that we were going. And later I went to BU, obviously, and, tried as I could whenever I was in a car to try and get WFAN with sort of mixed success. But for whatever, maybe it was a clear day that day or whatever, and we were able to listen to WFAN the whole way up. And we weren't really hockey fans in my family, and, we especially really weren't aware of things like the draft. So I kid you not, as we were driving onto the BU campus to go to the admissions building for our tour, we heard a flash, a sports update on WFAN, and that, it was like the every 20 minutes update that they used to do. And it was that Rick DiPietro from Boston University had been drafted first overall goalie for the Islanders. And so it was kind of funny because we were driving up and it was like, okay, wow, well, we're here. So there we go. I think that's an interesting point. I think the fact that it's probably the only school, I don't know, I mean, even other schools that they compete with pretty heavily in hockey, I think those tend to have other sports that are number one. I mean, obviously the big rival is BC, but my guess is if you walk around the BC campus, it's probably at least, I mean, it's definitely second to football and maybe even third to basketball, I would think. So that always kind of struck me, that sort of, it was the number one sport at BU, but at BC it was just kind of one of many, and that applies to Harvard and, all these other schools too.
Yeah, that's true.
I do think, real quick, college hockey especially, and there's a few other sports that it's the case in, but it's interesting because it's not in most of the country. It's a lot in New England and then the upper Midwest. But the places it exists, it's monstrous.
Yes, yes.
My school just had a club hockey team that nobody knew who was on it and where it was. But then you hear about whether it's in Minnesota or all of New England. If you have a college hockey team, a varsity college hockey team, it's a huge deal, or else you wouldn't have a varsity college hockey team at this point. So it's kind of like lacrosse in that way, like where you have schools that, like Johns Hopkins, which are not big sports schools by any means, but then they have this one program that's this monster thing because it's such a regional sport. So
the team gets started probably around when a lot of college hockey teams do in the late 19-teens, right around World War I. They don't really do much. They're independent through the 1940s and 50s. They don't join a conference. They join the ECAC, which stands for Eastern Collegiate
Athletic Association.
Well, no, it would be Eastern College Athletic Conference.
Oh, that was the back in the day.
Yeah, well, ECAC would always be conference, not association, wouldn't it?
Oh, you're right. I just remember chanting, because by the time I was there, we were in Hockey East, and it was EZAC, making fun of all the teams that stayed in that conference, whatever it was called. Anyway, I told you I was going to let you do the talking.
Well, that's why I'm the co-host, Janine. But thank you anyway. I hadn't corrected you on anything in a while, so I enjoyed that. So I think they really come into prominence in the early 60s, and that's when they bring in the first of their two legendary coaches, which is a guy by the name of Jack Kelley, and he coaches the team from 62 to 72, and his last 2 years are BU's first two championships. They win the NCAA tournament in 1970-71. They defeat Minnesota 4-2 in the championship, and then in 71-72, they defeat Cornell in the championship. They actually shut them out 4-0. And so this is right about when the team is really starting to come into prominence. And I didn't realize this until I started researching this, but Jack Kelley actually just passed away in the fall of 2000. He died at 93, and it was news in Boston, but probably didn't get out much beyond the New England area. But I was disappointed that we didn't know that he had passed away when we did our in memoriam, because he would have been a good guy to cover. We did the one BU hockey story. We talked about Travis Roy, but we didn't get into Jack Kelley. Kelley was sort of one of these guys who was like, he kind of like looked very much like a 50s hockey coach. If you see him, he's got the suit and the fedora and sort of, the thick kind of, 1950s style glasses, very much looked like a Boston hockey coach. But he was kind of the guy who really, I think, got the program into the prominence that it would really achieve over the next several decades under Jack Parker.
Yeah, the thing that always strikes me going back over it, it's discussed in the later eras as well, that a lot of their success was when he started recruiting Canadian players.
Yes.
Which had been kind of unheard of at the time, because people in New England are obsessed with, being from New England, and people from New England being better than everybody else in the world. And so, I guess it paid off and became, part of the tradition for I guess that continues to today. And I guess he's kind of almost started the trend, because now there are Canadians on every roster in every American college team.
Yeah, and that is definitely the case. And one of the things early on was that BU was really big on recruiting Canadians, and that was Jack Kelley. But BC stayed sort of very, very local, recruited the local guys a lot more. So there started to be this tension in the 60s and 70s. And the rivalry with Boston College kind of starts in, around this time in the 60s. And BC actually is coached by a guy by the name of Snooks Kelley, who, in researching for this, I watched a DVD that Janine was good enough to turn me on to called Battle of Com Ave, which is shorthand for Commonwealth Avenue. If you're a Boston person, you know that. And it was all about the rivalry between BU and BC. And this Snooks Kelley, he just, with BC, he just seemed like a real character too. He was this sort of portly looking guy. And so, one of the cool things about the rivalry, I think right from the beginning, is you get a lot of characters, in the history of BU hockey and of the BU BC rivalry. And it's such a tribal sport up there. It's not just the colleges. It's played so much. Youth hockey, I mean, where we grew up, and I would imagine it was probably similar to where you grew up in Long Island, Janine, not that far, all things considered from where we were. There were kids that played youth hockey. It was definitely something that that happen. You talked about playing it yourself, but it's almost like a religion in New England. It really is. There's a ton of kids that, as much as they love the Red Sox and as much as they love the Patriots now, and this, Celtics, have had their moments. There's a weird thing about hockey in the greater Boston area that I don't think can be replicated with any other sport. And I still think that there are probably people in Boston for whom the Bobby Orr Bruins of the 1970s were kind of the apex of sports in the history of Boston.
I mean, I yes, maybe. I think I've heard enough I heard stories from some of the other young ladies that I played with in college who, like, the Red Sox were still really their religion. I remember we once went to a Bruins game, some of us on the women's team, and one of my teammates, we talked because she was from the area and grew up in where did she grow up? One of the Roslindale. Someone was like, "Oh, did you and your sisters and your dad always, did dad take you to the games growing up?" And she was like, "No, we're mostly Red Sox fans."
Mm-hmm.
So even though she grew up playing hockey, it was still like the Red Sox are still that. But I think speaking to your point, and having grown up, like, my thing is that I wanted to play hockey since I became aware of it, and my parents were just they were so unfamiliar. They were just like, no, like, we don't think it's for girls. We don't want you to get hurt. We don't want to drive you. Like, all the things that they heard about hockey was like violence, practices at 5 a.m. You're very short. They were just like, no. But then by the time I convinced them to let me play, as far as I played in like a mixed boys and girls, like, developmental league for a year, and then in just like a regular local house league where I was one of like a handful of girls that would kind of cycle in and out. But there was a fledgling like girls travel team starting. And then meanwhile, when I went to BU, I met all these girls, many of whom were from the Boston area, who had all, like, their girls travel team had started when they were 10. So it really, I guess, to your point, it had been much more pervasive. And I guess, just it developed as part of the culture, probably because of Bobby Orr. And like you said, I'm from Long Island, where we have our own professional hockey history that definitely influenced people. And I wonder if it is that kind of like 10-year head start that they got because of that, or owing to Boston being an original 6 team in the NHL, that it goes back further than that, even before the Bobby Orr goal. But, it definitely is much more of a celebrated sport, much more of an ingrained sport than in other places.
So right around the mid 70s is when they bring Jack Parker in to be the coach. And Parker had played with the team, actually, even before Kelley was the coach. He'd been on the team in the early 1950s and had been sort of, coaching hockey in various places before getting the BU job. After Kelley retired in the early 70s, they also had a guy. Go ahead, Andrew. I'm sorry.
Because it's weird, because I see, okay, they won 2 straight national championships and then they changed coaches. It looks like he left to become the GM and coach of the New England Whalers, who at the time were in the WHA and within a couple of years were the Hartford Whalers of the NHL. So that must have been why he left, because
he had announced his retirement before the championship even was played.
Oh, really?
They knew he was going, yeah. And I guess you figure if he just died this past year in 2020, he was old when he died. He was 93, but, that means in the early 70s, that's, almost 50 years ago. He was still a young man. He was probably only in his mid-40s. So, yeah, and then I think he went on after that, Jack Kelley, to be, I think he was the general manager maybe, or the team president of the Pittsburgh Penguins in the 80s and 90s.
He was with the Whalers through the early 70s. Or he was there till the early 80s, and then he was the president of the Penguins from 93 to 01. So like right after their cups, their back-to-back cups. So, but he was the president for looks like 8 or 9 years in Pittsburgh.
So we're going to divert here for a minute, but it'll all make sense in a second. Janine, when you played on the women's team, it was still a club team?
Yes. So when I started in the fall of 2002, it was a club team. And there were rumors, because they were, I guess, had started building the new arena at BU, Agganis Arena, or they at least had the plans in place. And I guess once it was finalized because the reason that we'd always heard is that BU felt they should have, the women's team should be a D1 program, but it couldn't be supported with just the one arena. And once the plans were announced for the new one, we kind of knew it was only a matter of time. And so I think the summer between my sophomore and junior year, which would have been 2004, it was announced that the team would be, there would be a D1 team starting in 2005, 2006. And at the time, the policy at BU was that if there was a D1 program in a sport, there was no club team. And so that was kind of for my teammates and I, that was, again, we knew it was on the horizon once they announced they were building a shiny new building for the men's team. Somewhat, I guess, controversial in our locker room, where people, really felt like the being on the women's team was their kind of sole social outlet, and their, it was like having a family. Being on any team, when you spend that much time together and devote yourself to playing a sport and having a common goal every year, it's kind of a big deal. So I knew that I wasn't skilled enough to be on the team. I might have put some effort into it, because we were given every opportunity to kind of be a part of the process. Mm-hmm. I mean, I'm sure we'll get into it further, so I don't want to do it in too much detail, but the women's team was club and had been very accomplished before I got there. And I think what started to happen was that women who would have otherwise wanted to go to BU to participate in the club team kind of saw that it wasn't going to have a D1. There wasn't going to be a D1 opportunity there anytime soon. And they opted to go to other schools, or, we also had people who came who were very skilled hockey players, but didn't necessarily, they wanted to do other things. They didn't want to devote themselves to playing on a club team. They wanted to explore whatever else was going on, on a vibrant, university campus. So the short answer is yes, it was a club team at first. And then by the time I left, it had gone D1.
Was the coach who eventually coached the team when they became a D1 team, was he also the coach when they were a club team?
No, he was not. He was Brian DeRocher, who is he's still the women's club, the women's coach now. He was associate head coach under Coach Parker for a long time. And they announced, so this summer when they announced that the team was going to be D1, they announced that he was going to be the coach. And at first we were very confused. We were like, is he going to coach us? Like, what's going on? But he was busy setting up the program. But he was around. He would bring recruits to our practices, and he got to know us a little bit. And he also, we can disclose that the way that you and I know each other is that we spent the semester in Washington. And that was the last semester. It was the second half of the season, the last season of the BU club hockey team. So I had always planned to go to DC that semester. That was part of my academic schedule for myself. Whereas a lot of my teammates couldn't believe that I was leaving in the middle of the season to go do a thing for my major, to intern in Congress. They were like, what do you mean you're not going to be here for the last, to close out the hockey team season? And it wasn't that I didn't want to be there. It just didn't jive with my schedule. From what I heard and later found out, that Coach DeRocher was very welcoming and open, that anyone who wanted to kind of work out with the trainers who were going to be working with the women's team, or wanted to basically try out to walk on to the women's varsity team, would be allowed to. A few of my teammates did. Some of them did. If I was, I think, younger and maybe would have had more of an opportunity than just one season to be on the team. But my attitude was kind of I wasn't going to bust my ass trying to make a team that I had no business being on just to sit on the bench out of some kind of courtesy. Our head coach was a woman named Kirsten Matthews, who did go on to be an assistant coach under DeRocher for a few seasons. And she is now the women's coach at St. Anselm College, which I believe is a D3. It's a pretty accomplished D3 program.
I kind of wanted you to use the name Brian DeRocher, who was a player on the team that won the national championship in 1978, and we're going to talk about that in a second. But first I have to ask Andrew if that name rang any bells for you.
Brian DeRocher.
Yeah, don't think about it too hard.
The first thing I would think is Leo DeRocher's relative. Leo DeRocher.
That's his great uncle. His great uncle was Leo DeRocher.
Great uncle?
I'm sorry?
How is he Leo DeRocher's great uncle?
The other way around.
Oh, yeah, that's wow. That's you wouldn't have thought that, but wow.
Yeah, no, Leo DeRocher was his great uncle, and he remembered playing cards with him, and he also was close enough with him that they actually attended his Hall of Fame induction. The Brian DeRocher and his father attended Leo's Hall of Fame induction in the early 90s.
Anybody who's listening to this podcast probably knows, but Leo DeRocher, famous manager of the Brooklyn Dodgers and then later the New York Giants, also credited with one of the most famous quotes of all time Well, two of them. One of them I can say. And that was the nice guys finish last, which isn't exactly the way it was said, but it's, kind of persevered throughout the ages as a Leo DeRocher quote.
He comes from a good sports pedigree, and finally meets his uncle at some point in the 60s for his great uncle for the first time. So lots of connections there. So Jack Parker becomes the coach in the mid-70s after Kelley leaves and after another guy sort of doesn't pan out after a season, and he would remain as the coach for another 40 years. And Andrew just sent me a text with a story about Leo DeRocher and Jackie Robinson and the way they used to trash talk each other. We'll have to do an episode on that one time. I'll have to clear it with Arnie first to do an explicit language episode. But so I want to talk a little bit about Jack Parker, but Janine, as a fan and somebody, who went to a lot more games than I did in college, what were your sort of impressions of Jack Parker, the coach?
I guess definitely kind of like a serious old school type, wherever you were in the arena, you could be very aware of his emotional state. And I guess people become, specifically in hockey, I mean, it's a lot of personalities, a lot of rough around the edges types, and he definitely came off as fitting in that mold, I guess. But at the same time, I guess he always seemed very kind of grandfatherly to me, and kind of as I came to know more, it's sort of back in the day, he was even more edgy and even more scream at the refs, kick guys in the behind verbally type than even during my time there.
Yeah, so there's a great book called Jack Parker's Wise Guys, the National Champion BU Terriers, the Blizzard of 78, and the Road to the Miracle on Ice, and it's written by a gentleman by the name of Tim Rapoli. I've read it, very highly recommended if you want to learn more about the BU hockey team of that era. And yeah, Parker, I think, even though, as Janine said, he was always sort of a taskmaster and a serious coach, he was, I think, almost downright crazy in his early years. He was somebody who would smoke on the bench. He would sit on the bench in a college hockey game and smoke cigarettes. Now, even in the 1970s, I don't think that was somebody that was common. He was a yeller. He was a screamer. They hadn't won any titles under Parker before this 77-78 season, and one of the things that happened immediately prior to this season is that there was the graduation of one of their star players. Probably their most famous alum from a hockey point of view was Mike Eruzione, who everybody knows later went on as the captain of the U.S. hockey team in 1980. And I believe, even to this day, Eruzione plays a pretty big role as sort of an ambassador for the BU hockey team.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely.
I remember a couple times, one time even, I think it was, I know that, and we'll talk about the team that won the championship in 2009. There was another time when they were in the NCAA tournament, and it was not in DC, but, I was at a function watching the game in DC, and I think Mike Eruzione was even there. So he's very much sort of the face of BU hockey sort of publicly. If anybody, even in New England, he's probably the first one that people can mention. The strange thing is never played in the NHL. Some of those other guys from around that era went on to play in the NHL, but Mike Eruzione, I think he probably had some tryouts or something like that, but I don't know if he was ever drafted. I don't know that he ever actually played in the NHL, but somebody who's managed to be not just in Boston, but nationally a big figure because of his role on the 1980 Olympic team.
Yeah, I don't think he played in the NHL, but he played in some of the lower professional leagues at the time, I think, a lot of which are not even around anymore. But I have a feeling also that I think he was, because I'm telling you, if he graduated from BU in 77, because I know he was a little bit older, even when the Miracle time, in the Miracle Olympics occurred, It might have just also been a case of him kind of missing the boat as far as being in his prime and not. Another significant thing that happened during my time at BU is that the movie Miracle came out. Yes. Which of course featured the four BU guys who were pivotal in the U.S. upset underdog victory against the Soviet Red Army. Yeah, something that I think might have been glossed over a little bit is that he was a little bit, I guess, old, one of the old, not veteran status, but a little bit older. So I guess just the timing for him didn't quite work out with that. And I don't know if it's a question of also wanted to go out on top. I feel like in appearances and stuff, he's kind of joked about it that if he, 2 inches to the left, then I would have had to get a job as a roofer.
It's just, I've heard him in the HBO, I think, documentary from years and years ago. He said something like, my friends tell me 6 inches to the left and you'd be blowing glass for a living. So,
yeah.
I looked it up. He was born in October of 54. So he would have already been 25, halfway to 26 by the time the Winter Olympics in 80 happened. So certainly not old by any means, but for hockey standards, especially in that day and age, you're right. He may have just kind of missed the boat.
Yeah, Eruzione, as Janine alluded to, one of the 4 BU graduates that ends up on the 1980 Olympic team. The other 3 are Jim Craig, who's the goalie, Jack O'Callahan, and Dave Silk. All 4, I believe, born in Massachusetts. So a very local flavor on that 1980 men's hockey team. If you've seen the movie Miracle, you know that one of the big rivalries was between the BU hockey players and the players from Minnesota. And that didn't start when they got to the team in 1980. There's a story here in this book, the Jack Parker's Wise Guys that I was talking about, a story from a BU Minnesota game in the mid 1970s. And this is actually Brian DeRocher telling the story. He says, Mike Fiddler walked over and challenged the entire bench. I'm sure they had great, tough players on the Minnesota team, but that was part and parcel for Mike, the Charlestown edge, and all of that. A minute and 8 seconds into the NCAA semifinal game, it didn't make a lot of sense. Chaos reigned, and a half hour of unmitigated brawling raged on. Finally, the NCAA officials shut out the lights. So college hockey was a very different atmosphere in the late 70s than it is now, whether it's players fighting. There's a story in here about how one of the players on the BU team had one of his friends from, his local Boston area friends just slept in his dorm the entire season, the entire school year, I think, which if you know anything about BU and the way the guest policy was when Janine and I were there, that was no small feat, getting somebody to sleep in your room for the entire school year. And just the team in general was sort of, even the book talks about rowdiness, and the title of this book by Tim Rappleye is Jack Parker's Wise Guys. They had another guy on the team by the name of Dick Lambie, who was another local kid. And he at one point became upset with Jack Parker, and because he had been taken off the power play. And here's a dialogue from the book. It says, "Can I talk to you, coach?" said Lambie. "Sure," said Parker. "When am I getting back on the power play?" "I don't know," said Parker, making a face. "I'm tired of watching your stuff. I'll go through every single defenseman on this team before I go back to you." Undeterred, Lambie pressed on. "Well, I'll tell you, you put me back on the power play, your family will be eating steaks for a month." Parker was in disbelief. "What is that, Dickie? Is that a bribe?" "Just making a statement," said Lambie. "Put me back on the power play, your family will be eating steaks for a month." "What is he talking about?" said Parker to himself. "I found out later that some of his criminal friends in Worcester would hijack a truck full of meat. He had some extra steaks floating around that he could get if he needed them. Oh, Dickie, he was something." So it was sort of that hard scrabble, working class Boston atmosphere. But this 77-78 season is a really unique season in BU lore. And it's really an interesting season for a few reasons. And the first of them is probably what happens in the Beanpot. And maybe Janine can just tell our audience a little bit about what the Beanpot is all about. Because if you're not from Boston and you're not a college hockey fan, you might not know about the magic that is the Beanpot.
The Beanpot is an annual tournament played the first 2 Mondays in February for the men and the first 2 Tuesdays in February for the women, between BU, BC, Harvard, and Northeastern. And I guess that it's a rotating basis as far as which teams play each other in the first round, and then the second week is the championship round. As an aside, like I said, there's a men's Beanpot, which is obviously the big draw and the most popular ticket in town around that time. And there's also been a women's Beanpot going back however many decades. And even though BU did not have a D1 team, the BU women's club team had the pleasure of playing against the D1 schools to which we were assigned, if any given year, which led to some.
You got some scores there.
Yeah,
Janine,
yeah.
I saw a 24-0 in there.
Oh yeah, of course. I'm sure there was. I know my sophomore year, I guess, one of the equipment managers for the men's team, who would later go on to be the equipment guy for the women's team when it became D1, he told us that if we scored a goal against BC, he would wash all of our equipment. And we scored that goal, and our equipment smelled slightly less bad for like a week after he washed it all. But that was the motivation, is that we,
Isn't that his job to wash the equipment?
He wasn't we were a club team. He was
the men's equipment manager. Okay, you're right.
Yeah,
you did say that. I'm sorry.
Like I said, he later went on to be assigned to the women's team, but he would sharpen our skates and do it, but like it wasn't really his job. It was just more like a favor. But yeah, so that was par for the course. I mean, playing, even just like doing our warm up around, like I remember being in Harvard's arena and seeing like they had Olympians on their team, and just like walking by them, these like clearly women who are much more athletic than I could ever aspire to be. The Beanpot is very competitive. It's essentially an exhibition game, but it's for the biggest it's for bragging rights in the biggest I would argue the biggest college hockey realm that there is. So, and
it holds an interesting place in sports in New England, because it almost always starts the day after the Super Bowl. So it's kind of, sports is, hitting that famous February lull. And at least if you're in Boston or in New England and you're a college hockey fan, you have this other thing coming up with these great rivalries. As you can imagine, BU and BC dominate. BU has 30 Beanpot first place finishes, BC 20, Harvard 11, and Northeastern 7. In fact, one of the stories that I heard in my preparation for this was of Mike Eruzione in 1980.
Love the story. In
Lake Placid. Go ahead and tell the story, Janine.
Okay. I think they were getting ready to play the Soviet team, and I guess this is 1980, where news didn't travel quite as fast, and they're like literally getting ready to go on the ice to play like a very important game. And they get word from somebody. They get word trickles down that Northeastern won the Beanpot. And it's like the words that, like, Eruzione says to somebody else, like, "Hey, you hear this? Northeastern was the Beanpot." And they joke that was the other miracle that happened in 1980, that for Northeastern to actually win a Beanpot.
So in 78, BU, and then I guess the other thing that we should mention is this is played at the, at one time the Boston Garden, and then now the TD Bank North Garden, and all of the various banks that arena has been named after over the last 25 years. It's, I think it might be the only opportunity until the Frozen Four, until the NCAA championships, that these teams get to play in, professional basketball and hockey arena. So the Beanpot was always played at the Boston Garden, and there was this crazy blizzard during the first game of the first week of the Beanpot in 1978. BU beat BC 12-5, and there were fans that were stuck in the arena, I think, for like several days. And they story about a guy sleeping in a luxury box for 2 or 3 nights. Just a crazy story. And
the crazier part too is that in the Wise Guys book, they talk about how the PA announcements in the arena kept saying, like, the last train is leaving, like, we recommend everyone leave, and people just stayed. And that's all you need, that's all you need to know about college hockey fans in Boston. They said, no, we want to stay here and finish watching this game. We don't care that there's a major weather event that's going to strand us in this arena for a week. We want to stay and watch this game.
Yeah, it was so Harvard played Northeastern in the first game, and then BU beat BC 12-5 in the second game, which I'm sure when you're trying to beat a blizzard, having a 17-goal game probably doesn't help anything. And there was a line here that I wanted to read.
While you're looking for that, I read an article, probably from a few years ago, where they were talking about this. And I guess during that game, they started making announcements like, hey, you really might want to consider leaving, especially those probably people who didn't venture out knowing the weather was coming. And then I guess at some point the announcements changed from "you really should leave" to basically at this point you have to stay.
Yes, yes. Speaking of missing the boat.
literally you've missed every form of transportation out. So, I guess then there was. Sorry, Dan, if you found it, go ahead.
No, I think we're on the same article. We're looking at the same article, and I'll throw this up in the show notes. The other thing that's interesting, if you look at this article, is that, did you see this, Andrew? Did you see the sportscast or the newscast that they show about this?
Len Berman embedded in the artitle.
Len Berman. Janine, do you know who that is?
Yes, I know who Len Berman is, please.
Okay.
Please.
Another New Yorker. Yes, I had no idea Len Berman was ever even a newscaster in Boston, but there he is telling the story of the Beanpot with a very late 1970s haircut. So the team is basically stranded for most of, there's no class for a week, which was another thing that at BU you didn't really see much of in those days. I think most of the team spent their time drinking, several days at a time at a bar called the Dugout, which you're a BU fan. If you're a BU student, you know about the Dugout. The other couple things I think that are interesting to talk about from this 78 season, first of all, it was kind of the beginning of the sort of prominence of Jim Craig, who is the BU goalie and then would go on to be the goalie on the U.S. Olympic team. 78 is sort of when he really becomes a really, really good goalie. And he, unlike Eruzione, does go on to play in the NHL for at least for a few years, kind of bounces around. 78 is also the only time that BU and BC play against each other in the finals, and it's played, I think, in Providence, I believe.
Yes, Providence.
So, it's this whole sort of New England, the two Boston teams playing only about 45 minutes away. And then the other part of this that's really interesting, that's kind of a sad story, is that throughout this season, unbeknownst to most people, and I think really even sort of unbeknownst to most of the players on his own team, Jack Parker, Coach Parker, his wife is very sick with cancer, and, young woman, I think she's got, they have two young kids, 2 kids under the age of 10, I believe, and she actually passes away, towards the end of the season, and he's able to have this great professional triumph in the midst of all of this sort of personal adversity. And they always said that in a way, and again, this is in this Rapalai book, Jack Parker's Wise Guys, that the death of his wife leads to him maybe to calm a little bit more, to put things in perspective. He quits drinking. A couple of years later, he quits smoking, so no more smoking on the bench. And, it's kind of still an intense coach, but sort of mellows a little bit. And that in the lore of BU college hockey, that 1978 team kind of goes down for their rowdiness, their reflection of the city in which they play, and also for being a sort of a stepping stone for what would become probably the most famous hockey team in American history, that 1980 team a couple of years later. So lots of interesting stuff there from that 1978 team. Do either of you have anything to add? I want to jump forward a little bit here.
Yeah, the only thing, speaking about that, I don't know if it was because of his wife being so ill, but Coach Parker would bring his kids along with him, his 2 daughters, like they his older daughter, who was, like you said, about 9 or 10 at the time, who would be on the bus with these like college hockey dudes, just like watching them play cards, like watching them, and they let her hang around. So as much as they were wise guys, I think they also brought out that there was this kind of, I don't know, a certain kind of respectability or softness, and that they let this 10-year-old girl come along for the ride with them. And that even, I think it said she was particularly close with Dave Silk, who wanted her to be, the older daughter Allison, to be in the team picture when they won the championship, and that she was too shy to go in. But I just thought it was another nice little element of everything, as weird as that must have been to have, like you said, the this like professional sports triumph literally weeks after his wife passed away. Such
a personal tragedy. Absolutely. And
I think I wanted to touch it that I thought was interesting looking at that 78 team was, the 4 years before that, they'd won the conference tournament and then, not followed through and been able to win a national championship. But then in 78, they actually lost the semifinal game to Providence 5-1, and then turned around and went on that run in the NCAA, and won the the national championship despite having lost in the tournament.
Well, and not only that, this is another very niche thing that we don't spend too much time on, but I didn't even realize that they only made it into the Frozen Four based on, they had to play a play-in game, I guess, because they had lost in the conference tournament. They had such a great season where they were basically undefeated until the playoffs. But then because they lost the ECAC, they lost in the ECAC semifinal, the ECAC committee, I guess, couldn't decide who to send to the championship, who from the conference to send to the Frozen Four. And so it was going to be either BU or Providence. And then they forced them to play this extra game, which BU then won. And so, of course, Providence was really pissed. And I guess, obviously they have come along from that. But again, that also, I don't know that would fly today. I guess, every conference and every sport has its policy on what the tiebreaker is and what the circumstances are that would lead to a play-in game. But that was, I hadn't known about that until reading this Rapalli book. I mean, it sounds insane.
Yeah, I think I'm, my background is much more of basketball, but it just amazes you how sort of strange the qualifications were for these tournaments. I mean, the NCAA basketball tournament at one point, you could only get in it if you won your conference, right? So you had a conference like the ACC and you'd only have one team I believe that's the case. I could be remembering that wrong. And it's just very, it was always strange. And then they at some point they realized that, hey, we ought to just get the best teams in and not make everybody jump through 100 hoops.
And one thing they did with basketball, I know you want to move on to, is like back then the regions were actually regions. And
I was going to mention that. Yeah,
was able to win as much as they were. Was that obviously they were a really good team, but they were on the West region, so they didn't have to go through. They had a much easier road to the Final Four than the other teams did. But that's not. That's a topic for another episode.
That's the topic for the last two episodes is college basketball and LaSalle and
teams that would have beaten UCLA, but we can move on.
Yeah, if you listen to the last two episodes, which have not, at time of recording, those have not even been posted yet. In fact, they haven't even been edited yet, if I'm going to be totally honest about my slacking. But by the time you hear this, you'll have heard that. So I want to fast forward here. Parker won 3 titles. 95, I don't want to spend too much time on that because I think it's probably maybe the least storybook of the 3, but they were a very good team. The best player was probably Chris Drury, who's the only BU hockey player with at least 100 goals and 100 assists. Later spends a bunch of time in the NHL. I remember him on the Rangers. I think, didn't the Rangers, and then I'm going to really show my hockey ignorance, didn't the Rangers make it into the Stanley Cup Finals? When was that? Do you guys remember?
I think it was 11. It was 11 or 12 because they lost to the Kings in 5.
Yeah, I wanted to say 08, but 11. Maybe it was 11.
I remember Drury being on one of the Ranger teams that went deep. I don't know whether it was the team that went to the finals or was one of the teams that went deep. I think I also remember him sort of having a reputation as being kind of like a pest. I don't know if maybe I'm confusing him with somebody else, but I seem to remember watching a playoff game one time and he was like harassing the goalie and sticking his stick in his face and everything. So that may not be him, but I feel like I remember him being the guy who did that. So that's a good team. 95. The following year, in fact, the game that they raised their banner to the roof after the 95 championship is the whole Travis Roy story, the 11 seconds. We mentioned him in our In Memoriam episode, so I won't relitigate the whole story there, but that's something that sort of becomes a BU lore as this player who was, paralyzed 11 seconds into his first college hockey game, his first shift. So that sort of adds to the lore. And, they're decent for the next couple years. They lose in the NCAA Final Four and, in the second round, not the second round, I'm sorry, in the semifinal game that year. They lose in the championship to North Dakota in 97. And, they're just kind of around, they win a couple of Hockey East titles. They don't win a championship again until 09, which is about 4 years after I graduate and 3 years for Janine. Before we get into sort of that 09 team, because that's such a crazy story, Janine, sort of maybe from like a just in general, atmosphere, but also kind of, sort of maybe an on the ice perspective too. Who were sort of some of the great players, great moments, great kind of whatever during the time that you were there?
Sure. I was going to say, I hope we can talk about 05-06 team, which was my senior year. The team was very good. They won the Beanpot that year. They won. I remember when all was said and done, they won three championships, and it looked like we were planning. I had a friend. We were planning on driving to Wisconsin to go to the Frozen Four. Like that's how confident we were in the team making it. As far as some of the players, I'm trying to think. One of the bigger stories from the men's team when I was at BU was a goalie named John Curry, who had been, I think he was like basically a recruited walk-on, where they basically said, we don't have a scholarship for you, but if you want to come and like try to be the third goalie, you're welcome. So he basically it was thought that he was going to basically ride the bench for the entire time there, which is not atypical to have just a third goalie who hangs around just in case and might never see any action during his entire career. But I guess it would have been the beginning of the 04-05 season. It was thought that there was a junior goalie and like a very highly touted Canadian freshman goalie who it was thought were going to split the time. And like as far as share, like, 1A, 1B netminder situation. But they went to some tournament out west to start the season, and both those guys got off to very shaky starts, and everyone was kind of like, oh, well, they're not going to play the third guy, like this Curry, who even is he? And that's the story of how John Curry became the starting goalie for the BU team for the next 3 years. So that was always kind of I always thought that was kind of a cool story. Dave Vandergulik was one of the more highly touted forwards. He played some time in the NHL after graduating. That season, defenseman Matt Gilroy was a freshman. He would go on to be one of the co-captains of the 09 championship team, and he also won the Hobey Baker Award as the best player in college hockey.
He was probably one of the best guys that they've had as far as just, great player that I can, I remember him, and I wasn't even there when he was there, but that's just a remember. He actually started his NHL career with the Rangers, it looks like.
He did. He didn't, unfortunately didn't last very long in the NHL. I don't know. I just didn't really pan out for him as tends to happen. I mean, you as much as college hockey has kind of come along and produced some great players, it's kind of, I don't know, it's still been however many years since then. So maybe by now it's kind of gone a step further, but you kind of tend to have that happen.
I think maybe the international aspect of that doesn't help either because, pretty much every NFL football player plays college football in the United States. They're Americans, a little bit less with basketball, but still the vast majority. Whereas you got these guys not only coming in from Canada, but coming in from Russia and Europe. So even in just looking this up, BU hockey doesn't have a single player in the NHL in the Hockey Hall of Fame. But, it's just such a college hockey in the grand scheme of NHL hockey is just such a smaller sliver.
Absolutely.
It's not the only path in like it is in the other sports where it's
right. And it to the extent that it is a path in, it's often thought of as the least heralded when you think about guys coming from junior or guys coming from, the other European leagues. And I guess the thing that I would say, another player, Brandon Yip, was also a freshman on that team. He also went on to play in the NHL. And then I think also, a lot of them are guys who, if they can make it to the NHL, they may not last that long. And then they may go and play in Europe or other random places, perhaps an opportunity to extend their career a little bit instead of, basically just hanging it up. And the other thing I would say again about the 06 team is just that the team I think they basically didn't lose a game all of second semester and really seemed like they were forging ahead, at least to the Frozen Four, maybe more. And to that point, as far as when I'd been there, it kind of seemed like we knew that we were always going to make like the Hockey East tournament and could possibly win it or at least do well enough to then make the NCAA tournament. And then usually it's like we would lose to like some Western team that we hadn't played before that was just bigger and faster. I mean, I remember like losing 5-0 to North Dakota in one game or losing to this or that other team that we hadn't, that they weren't that familiar with. But in 06, in winning the Hockey East title, I think BU beat, I want to say New Hampshire, like 9-1 in the semifinal game and then beat BC in overtime. I
see the Hockey East semifinal. They beat New Hampshire 9-2.
Yeah. And then they beat BC in the championship game in overtime. And then the following weekend, they beat, I think, Nebraska Omaha in the first round game, like 9-1 or whatever that score was.
9-2. Janine, you're proving your value to this podcast by the minute. as I stare at Wikipedia and you rattle these off from memory.
So then they drew BC in that, the regional, finals with the winner moving on to the Frozen Four. And this team had beaten BC, I think 5 times up to that point, considering maybe it was 4 times because there's 3 regular season meetings and the Beanpot final. No, it was 5 times because it was the 3 regular season meetings, the Beanpot final.
And then the week before.
And then the week before the Hockey East final. And we were, it's always like nerve-wracking, these games. We were like, no, if there was ever a time when this is going to happen, this is going to be it. And as you're seeing on the Wikipedia right now,
they didn't just lose, they smoked them.
No, and it was, again, being the fan of a team and watching them all season and knowing them inside and out. And again, having been on the women's team, getting to know the players a little bit and just seeing them around campus as human beings as well as heralded athletes, to then come and see that, it was very, very disheartening. It was, the biggest heartbreak that you could have as a fan of something. And then, to make matters worse, I just so happened to be walking down Bay State Road the next day, and who do I see but several members of the BU men's hockey team. Oh, geez. And ordinarily this would be a cause for maybe they'll say hi to me. Maybe we'll exchange a little nod. And I wanted nothing. I didn't know what to say. I didn't know what. And of course, one of them shouts my name from across. I didn't even think we were friends, me and this guy. But they maybe had a few consolation beverages this day. He was very eager to say hello. He had some choice words about how other people thought they were failures, and I had to comfort this young gentleman to assure him that he was not a failure, that we appreciated their efforts and really felt horrible for what happened and knew that they tried their best and that was it. But yeah, that was the lasting imprint of my my time at BU as a hockey fan, was this unfortunate end to the season.
Yeah, and to have it happen at the expense of your biggest rival, not only the fact that you'd beaten them so many times already in the year, which is really kind of a strange, that's very much a college hockey thing, is to play a team so many times in a season, and then to not only lose, but to just get totally smoked. But they make up for it in 2009, and 2009, I just want to see it. That is sort of one of the most famous games probably in the history of college hockey. Now, college hockey is not, they don't have a lot of games that are deep in the canon of sort of mainstream sports attention, but they have a decent year, and then they go to the Frozen Four, which is the NCAA hockey tournament's only 16 games. What they do is they play the first 2 rounds on a weekend. I think it's actually coming up. It's coming up this coming weekend. Although by the time you people listen to this, it'll be it'll be the third week of baseball season probably. But it's coming up this last weekend in March, and then they take a week off because the NCAA is not letting anything mess with the Final Four, and then they play the Frozen Four, the hockey, the following weekend. And I'm not a devout college hockey fan, especially for those couple of years I was living. You mentioned Roslindale before. That's where my wife and I lived for a couple of years when we were up there. I've gotten a lot more into it after having lived up there and gone to a bunch of games. It's kind of a nice change of pace. So, this Saturday when we sit down to watch 4 basketball games in a row, it'd be nice to also have the hockey on there. So it's fun. If you're a sports fan, it's fun to have it as sort of a second thing that's going on during the whole March Madness time. So anyway, BU wins their first 2 games, and then they go 2 weeks later. And I really remember this because this Frozen Four was in DC. My wife, she wasn't my wife then. She wasn't even my girlfriend then. We knew each other. And a bunch of my other friends went to both of the games in DC. One was on a Thursday night and one was on a Saturday night. It was Easter weekend, which comes into play in a way for me that I think Andrew will appreciate. But
you always refuse to watch television on Easter weekend, I believe, because you've said before that you believe it should be for the Lord, I believe. Where you're going with this story, is that correct?
That is not correct, but we'll get to that in a second. So now, Janine, you came to DC. You were at the final game, right? Just the championship game.
I was going to say, it's also Passover weekend some of the time for those of us of that particular faith. And so that particular year, Passover was starting on the Thursday night, which was the night of the Frozen Four semifinals. And so I was looking at the calendar, looking at this, thinking like, oh, BU's having a great season. Like maybe we can, and like the Frozen Four is in DC. When is that going to happen? Like when are the Frozen Fours could be in Madison? They could be in, I think 1 year it was in Tampa. I mean, it was just, I had my eye on it because it was like actual driving distance, from where I am. But I was looking at that Thursday day and I was like, okay, well, I'm not going to pay tickets and arrange to go to DC for a whole long weekend. And I was also in law school at the time, which was another consideration about missing class and study time, my internship and stuff. So I was kind of just looking at that one. And I was like, well, if they make the championship game on Saturday, maybe we can just go to that. And I didn't want to get my hopes up. I wasn't sure that it would actually happen. And then so during trying to be pious and participating in Passover, I was also trying to check in on the scores. And later that night found out that BU had won their semifinal game and would in fact be playing for the national championship. And I was kind of like, oh, I don't know. And my then fiance, now husband, was basically like, we have to go to this game. Like if we don't go to this game, you're going to regret it for the rest of your life. So we found tickets on I guess it must have been StubHub. And it was to the point where it was so close to the game time that we wound up driving down to DC on Saturday morning, picking the tickets up at some like weird FedEx pickup facility, because I guess the tickets couldn't be mailed to us. And I guess they also wouldn't do a box office situation. So,
and there were no electronic tickets, really weren't something that was out there yet.
Exactly. This was the best option they could come up with at the time. And of course that was its own nerve-wracking thing where what if we drive to DC and our tickets aren't the tickets aren't really tickets? Like, you never know with these things. But so we did that and we made it basically just in time for the game. So
I want to back up a step here because I would imagine that the BU, if we have folks that are BU hockey folks that are listening to this, they'll remember that Saturday night game because it was just, again, even if you put aside any sort of fact that, we were fans of this school, this was a crazy sports story, this Saturday night game they played against Miami of Ohio. This is like, insane. This was on Sports Center, in the first 5 minutes because they won this crazy game. And we'll talk about that in a second. So, but the Thursday night game, they played against Vermont, and that in and of itself was sort of a crazy game. And I remember because this was the game I watched, and we'll get to that in a second. But they were down. They were down 3-2 and 4-3. They ended up winning in overtime, and the winning shot was deflected off of a Vermont player in order for BU to win the game. I guess it would have been 5-4, and so. As crazy, in retrospect, what happened 2 nights later was crazy, but they really got off to a crazy start, even just that first Thursday night. And I remember thinking to myself, like, God, that was such a crazy game, and not really expecting to be all that into it. But then after watching this crazy game on a Thursday night in Vermont, I'm like, I got to watch this championship game. So... For a very long time, on the Saturday night before Easter, would drive to Pennsylvania to spend the night with my grandparents. And, we would have dinner and then we'd go have breakfast Easter morning, and then I'd drive back to D.C. Where they lived in D.C. was only about 2.5 hours where they lived in Pennsylvania was only about 2.5 hours from D.C. And I had been at their house, I think the year before at Easter, and they had ESPN, and they're old people, they go to bed early, so I was like, all right, this game started at 8:00 or whatever. I'm like, I'll go to bed by 9:00 and I'll turn on this game. And so I go to their house, and I had watched ESPN at their house before. I had swear it. They go to bed, and I turn on the TV, and I can't find ESPN. Somehow, whatever their kind of bare bones minimal cable package that they have didn't have ESPN.
And I should just point out, because I wasn't there. I was at our house in Alexandria.
Oh, that's right. I keep forgetting you were living in DC. I forgot all about that part of it.
I happened to be watching this game. Our grandparents lived in basically Pennsylvania Dutch country. in an old folks home, retirement community at 9 o'clock going, I'll just go find a bar where I can watch college hockey. It was not going to happen. So for anybody who's wondering why that wasn't an option.
I actually kind of was sort of somebody who I actually had a quote unquote smartphone before a lot of other people did, because working where I worked, I had a BlackBerry, a work issued BlackBerry, and, you couldn't do anything on it really. You couldn't do, there are no apps or anything like that, but you could get on the internet and you could check a score, check whatever. And I remember watching this, checking the score, and with like 2 minutes left in the third period, maybe even less than that, I checked it.
1 minute, yeah.
Yeah, but I don't remember when I checked it, though. I know it was 1 minute. They were down 3-1 until 1 minute. I don't know if I checked it then or checked it right before, a little bit before that. And so finally I'm like, all right, I'm just going to go to sleep. I went in the guest bedroom at their house. And it was funny, too, because of all the friends I had from BU, they were probably all too busy having fun to be messaging me. But I get a text from my friend Andy from high school, who, lives in the Annapolis area, and he and I would go to Maryland football games and everything. And he sends me a message, and he's like, holy, what? This BU hockey thing is crazy. And so I get up, and I saw that they had won 4-3 to win the national championship. So, Janine, since you're the one who was there, why don't you maybe tell us a little bit about that night and your experience?
Ooh, okay. It was, again, incredibly exciting, but also very exhilarating. Like, especially after what had happened in 2006, the disappointment. It's kind of like being on the edge of either like the greatest thing to ever happen to you, or like complete and total utter heartbreak. I mean, the things I can remember, our seats, my husband and I were sitting pretty far up in the upper bowl area of the arena, and we happened to be seated behind two women who were, it seemed like they were maybe Capitals season ticket holders or Capitals fans. They were not college hockey people, I could tell. It sort of became, I think because I think I want to say BU had a 1-0 lead early in the game. And, all of I guess there were more BU fans in the arena than Miami of Ohio fans. And these two women were sort of, they picked up on the rooting for the underdog situation. So once Miami got out to their lead, these women were like the biggest Miami of Ohio Redhawks fans in the entire universe. And they were like, really like, yeah, BU sucks. Like they were really, so that, like that, in addition to being like completely unnerved by the fact that we were down, I was like, we drove all the way here to watch this game, and now BU is down 3. Like, I'm like, it's happening again. Like, the disappointment is happening. It's coming for me. And these people in close proximity to me didn't make it any easier. Yeah, I just remember, being, but also, again, when it's your team, when you know how good they can be, you have that kind of like shred of hope. And so what happened was they were down 3-1 towards latter stages of the third period, and then they it gets like, oh, they're going to pull the goalie. Is that even going to work? Why the hell would anyone do that? Time comes, and once they made it 3-2, it was, I don't know. It's like, well, anything can happen now. And then again, I should have reviewed this video beforehand, because I'm going to show my fuzziness, and that the fact that this was almost 12 years ago. I want to say one of the goals was like a very kind of more like a scrappy random goal, and one of them was like I feel like a very nice pass from Gilroy. So it was like really just like, not only are they coming back, but they're doing it like with style, skillfully. It was like a very well executed, like, we've prepared for this situation when we need a goal, like in a really critical juncture of the game. I remember being very relieved that they were able to score the goal to make it 3-2, and then score the goal to tie it with only a few seconds left. And then everything's settling down, and everyone kind of recovering from the shock of it, the game going into overtime, and being like, all right, we're still in it. And then realizing that we had to sit through overtime, just complete and total nervous wreck.
Gilroy had the assist on the one that tied it with 18 seconds left. So that's probably the one you're thinking.
Yes.
Dan Shaughnessy, who, when my wife hears this, will make a face at, because he's a Boston sports columnist. I like him, and he's one of these guys. One of the cool things about sports in Boston is it's just there's just so much there as far as all the Celtics history and then the Red Sox and, now the Patriots and college football and, you college basketball even. And
do you just invoke college football talking about Boston
College, Flutie?
Okay, you not modern day.
This is hello old sports.
Allison's right about Dan Shaughnessy, though.
He if you know anything about Dan Shaughnessy, or if you only know one thing, he was the one who coined the term "curse of the Bambino" for all of the the struggles that the Red Sox had after for 80 some odd years after selling Babe Ruth to the Yankees. He called it quite simply the greatest college hockey game ever played. And it really is. I mean, if you just think about the improbability, again, not being a hockey expert, just knowing, that when a team pulls its goalie, I always kind of view pulling a goalie as sort of like when a team is down by 8 points with 30 seconds left and they start intentionally fouling. It's like, okay, we're all just going through the motions here. Like you can't not do it, but we know this isn't going to do anything. So, yeah. And so, to have them come back and win and to do it on ESPN with, Gary Thorne, who longtime Oriole broadcaster and, has done MLB playoff games. And I think he did some NFL for a while. Gary Thorne, a well-known sports broadcaster. I think that sort of added to the gravitas of it a little bit. So probably I would say the greatest moment in BU hockey history, and the fact that it happened, for me at least, even though I wasn't there, it was meaningful for a lot of my friends and, people that I know, because having it happen in DC and being able to be there for it. I mean, if you think about it, not a lot of college hockey goes on in Washington, DC. And so to just sort of, if you're a BU alumni in Washington, DC, and there are a ton of us, to have something like that happen in the city that you're living in as an adult is pretty cool. All right. So I just want to touch on a couple more quick things. I think we would be a little bit remiss if we didn't note that the coaching tenure of Jack Parker doesn't necessarily have the most noble end. He's the coach on this great team in 2009. And I just want to look here and see. I don't know exactly what his last season was. I don't know, Janine, if you know.
It was 2012, 2013.
2012, 2013. Yeah, that's what I'm seeing. And maybe I'll just jump forward real quick. He was replaced by David Quinn, who was a former player of his. I believe Quinn was on the team. Was he on the team that won the championship in the 90s? I bet he probably was, right?
I know he was a bit old. I want to say he was a bit older than that. He was an assistant coach on the 2009 championship team.
So maybe we'll sort of just take this in a little bit of reverse order here. Quinn coaches the team for 5 years from 13 to 18. The best year is probably, or is, his second year, where they lose the championship to Providence 4-3 in the championship game. I remember.
That was a heartbreaking game. Speaking of
that was a game because BU was up 3-2 going into the third period of that game. They didn't necessarily lose it as dramatically as they had won in 2009, but it was another one of these sort of dramatic end of the game wins, end of the game losses. I guess if you're a BU fan, if you have a BU perspective. I think that was the game I remember watching at a bar in Arlington, and Mike Eruzione came to the game watch party for a brief period of time. Quinn then goes on to coach the New York Rangers, and this is another one of those things where what's the case when we record versus when we when we actually air. But dawned on me probably later than it should have why there are all these conversations about the Rangers trading for Jack Eichel, who was the star of that. Was he on that 15 team, Eichel?
Yes, he won. I think he won the Hobie Baker that year too. I feel like that was his one college. I feel like he only played 1 year at BU, Eichel.
Yeah, he might. I remember going to see him play, but I don't think it was when I was living there. I think it was when we were visiting before we moved up there. But obviously, the reason why the Rangers are so keen on trying to trade for Jack Eichel is because their coach was his college coach. So Quinn had a very nice. Go ahead, Ange. I'm sorry.
I'm just going to take shots at the Rangers about being an also-ran in their own city and just being thoroughly outclassed, and they're going to have to watch the Islanders win the Stanley Cup this year.
I was going to say that the Rangers are talking about trading for Eichel because they have their heads up their own behinds and think that they're entitled to every superstar who may be on the trading block, because obviously everyone wants to come play for that cesspool of an organization.
Not a lot of Ranger fandom on the Hello Old Sports podcast. I'm sadly Sunday. I actually kind of we don't have to dwell on this, but I'm kind of a fan of all three teams and like to see them all three do well. But that's a story for a different time. So maybe just talk a little. We can just talk a little bit about kind of the culture that had emerged, I guess is the best way to put it. Jack Parker is basically, now he's an older man, and so who knows just how long he actually would have lasted as the coach, but his departure is accelerated by what gets discovered as sort of this kind of culture of entitlement among his players. It starts, as a lot of things tend to do in college sports, when teams get into disciplinary problems, and we talked about this last week when we talked about LaSalle and Gary Neal, players accused of some degree of sexual assault, sexual misconduct, that type of thing. Obviously alcohol is involved, obviously parties, all that type of thing. I don't recall off the top of my head what exactly came of those accusations, but it kind of, then they come up with this independent commission where they discover a culture of sexual entitlement. It even comes out that there were players who were having sexual relations with women in the penalty box, at the rink, at the new arena, at Aganis. That then also sort of, this investigation reveals sort of even further kind of this, more of sort of a general sort of entitlement issue, academic issues. Players are in a school, one that I actually taught in for a semester when I was in Boston, called Metropolitan College, which is kind of, it's not where an 18 or 19-year-old college student would end up. It's mostly a continuing education school. My class was a lot of people who either were employees of the university and just wanted to take a class, or adults who had not graduated from college and then were working on their degree part-time, working moms and, that type of thing. So these are all night classes, not where you would expect a 19 or 20-year-old undergraduate to be getting his degree. And then you heard, more things about just, players bullying others in the class and, answering their cell phone, just kind of a sense of entitlement. And I think for a school like BU that doesn't have a football team, that doesn't have a big-time college basketball team, that doesn't really have this, it's a very sort of, it's a different atmosphere than what you'd get even at like a BC. I don't know if liberal is the right word I would use, but there's there are a lot of sort of much more intellectual, politically very liberal type of, not just the students, but the professors. And so it's not necessarily, they have a
Alabama where it's just expected that everybody bends over backwards for the star athletes.
Yeah. I mean, we have a large fine arts school, it's very much an urban university. In some ways it's more like it's more like a Vassar almost in a lot of ways, as far as who the student body is, than a BC. So I think that for that reason, kind of having this hockey program where the attitude of the students didn't necessarily reflect the attitude of what the large percentage of the community was, I think probably made it even worse than, sort of like you said, Andrew, that if this had happened at a larger, sports crazy school.
Yeah, and I think it's just unfortunate that, a lot of these stories end this way, and certainly not to compare it to a guy, not to compare the infractions to a guy like Joe Paterno, which is obviously a much more serious thing. A lot of these 40-year runs that these coaches have don't end the way you imagine they would, where it's, national championship and then leaves, high on the hog, that sort of thing, where, especially when you're talking about college, there always seems to be a little thing where you kind of wish the guy had left 5 or 6 years earlier with his total reputation intact.
The other thing that I would bring about with that point as well is that in reading the Wise Guys book, there are allusions to the similar sorts of themes as well, as far as, I mean, it was kind of a joke where the one player like bribed Coach Parker to put him back on the power play, or there were also allusions to like, I guess all the players were like bartenders in the dugout because I guess the drinking age was lower back then. So there are allusions throughout that book as well to the guys being allowed to blow off steam. it's put in a little bit more of a polite terminology, but I think that's something that's, I guess, prevalent in a lot of the, I guess, to typical male men's sports, where a certain level of this is sort of accepted to a degree. And I guess, unfortunately, it can get out of hand, especially having been a female playing a typically male sport and having played on a local rec team in high school with guys. I mean, I have some stories that are not kind to, the male persuasion in general, as reflected through these particular individuals. Yeah, it is unfortunate that it comes out as like having tainted Coach Parker's legacy. And I guess, this was after I graduated and got kind of have pieced together what seemed to actually happen based on what I knew as a student, hearing about what goes on about the athletes, and not just the hockey team, but mostly the hockey team. Like, they always have like the easier majors. Like they always have the ones where they can get away with writing papers instead of taking tests, or going. Just, I guess they were afforded more flexibility to their academic schedule because they are the heralded athletes in the one big sport that actually makes the school money. So it's not a foreign concept. And also just pointing out that hockey in general is typically played by people from well-to-do backgrounds. That it lends itself to people who are from something of an entitled, or at least a comfortable financial situation. And all these guys, many of the guys they go first to prep school, or some of them even play junior B before they even get to college. So it was all kind of a recipe for something like this happening eventually.
I feel like that might be a big change from what you were talking about in the 70s, where it was a lot of, sort of local, maybe towny guys who obviously got to play at this elite college, but whereas then it was guys talking about their buddies knocking off a truck and can bribe somebody with steaks. 30 years later, it's like you said, it's guys who went to prep school and playing on the private teams and and all of that, and sort of the cultural shift around some of these sports, probably particularly with hockey, whereas guys might have been blowing off steam at bar in the 70s and bartending and getting paid for doing work they maybe weren't doing. You fast forward that a little and you can see how it might take on a little bit of a different air. So
yes. And in between that, something else I was also thinking about when researching for this and just looking back, the entire University of Vermont hockey program was shut down for, I think, 2 or 3 years at one point because they had some issue with hazing gone completely awry. Unfortunately, this sort of thing happens in sports from time to time. So I know that's, since I remember reading the report from the independent investigation.
I read it too, yeah.
Into the BU team. And I, again, having been there and been, being on the women's team and seeing what went on with the men's team and hearing some of these, the players like live separate from the rest of the campus and are insulated from everything. And it's like, well, yeah, like that. I mean, that was kind of just an accepted thing where like they always lived in the same dorms that were nicer than everybody else. And they always took the easy classes and they were never in. I think by the time I was there were a few of them were in the management school, which was regarded as like requiring actual, like, more academic focus than you would expect from someone on that team. And I think now a lot of them have gone on to be in that school and have other, I think they made a point of, shifting the culture away from what had bred this, more unfortunate situation.
Yeah, I think a few points I would make, and maybe this is where sort of I take off my sports hat and put on my my college professor hat a little bit. I find it. I mean, obviously, the sexual assault is the worst thing, but some of the other stuff, the penalty box sex and that stuff. I mean, that's a little jarring to hear about, but at the end of the day, who really got hurt? I mean, maybe the janitor who has to, clean up from a party the night before, but at the end of the day, there's a little bit of kind of just college kids being college kids. I find it troubling, and this sort of, Andrew, was to your point with Paterno, where when one of the many things that came out in the wake of the Paterno scandal was this idea that basically Paterno didn't want anybody to be able to discipline his players besides him. And I think, one of you guys alluded to it a little bit with Parker also. It's tough when it starts to creep into the experiences of ordinary students. If you're in a class and just trying to get your degree and, maybe you've got a work-study job and you're just trying to, go back to your crappy dorm and you're getting bullied by these hockey players, or if you're some professor who's trying to teach a class about intro to 18th century British literature or whatever, and all of a sudden you got 5 hockey players screwing off and answering their cell phones in the middle of the class, and you know there's nothing you can do about it. That's, I think, where this tension sort of arises between the university and the players and the team. The other thing that I think is interesting, and this is unique to hockey, is that these guys get drafted and then they keep playing college hockey. And a lot of times, I remember in what was the year that I was in Boston? I guess it was 17-18. They were in the tournament that year. I want to see, what was their record in 17-18? Because I was actually, my wife and I went to the first game of the NCAA hockey tournament. They played Cornell in Worcester, and we saw them. We saw them beat Cornell, or maybe we were at the Michigan game that they lost. I forget. We were one of the two that year. I forget which one it was. It was on a Saturday, so you could look it up. But 2 or 3 of the guys on the team were playing in the NHL a week later. And so it's like, what ability is some professor going to have to discipline some player when they know that this guy's probably 3 weeks away from going and making $600,000 a year, and the professor makes maybe 10% of that. So there's a weird power imbalance specifically with hockey. Also, let's end this on a little bit of a happier note. Janine, you talked about the women's program and your participation therein. Why don't you just tell us a little bit about, to the extent that you know, kind of where the women's program is today and where you think it's headed?
Yeah. Even having any, tenuous as my connection is to it, it's been really nice to see that they, after transitioning from being like our kind of, plodding little club team to a D1 program, they won Hockey East the women's Hockey East for the first time in 2010, just a few years after joining the league. They won it for 4 straight years from 2012 to 2015. They made it all the way to the NCAA championship game in 2011 and 2013. Probably their most accomplished player is a woman named Marie-Philippe Poulin, who I think she was the captain of the Canadian national team that I want to say won gold at the Olympics. Again, my knowledge is not as staunch as I would hope, but Brian DeRocher has been the coach the entire time. It was interesting to know him, when I was at school as the, assistant to Parker, and then rising varsity women's coach, and then read about his history being as a player. He's been with the team this entire time, and people have nothing but good things to say about him and his, leadership of the program. It's kind of nice how we were the only club team playing in the women's Beanpot, like for many, many more years than we should have been, given how storied the men's team was. Like BU needed to have a proper women's D1 program a lot sooner than they did. So it's nice that that's finally there. And as anyone might expect, the results have been seen.
Great. Well, Janine, thank you so much for joining us for this journey into the history of Boston University hockey, men's, but also women's. And a lot of great moments, lots of Beanpot wins, lots of national championships, and even a couple of blizzards where fans were stranded in the arena for 3 days. And
sounds fun. Well, they said by Thursday morning, they had to kick the people who were still there out because they obviously weren't going to leave on their own.
Incidentally, this is way far afield, but I don't know, Andrew, maybe you saw this. Have you seen this book that just came out about this guy who lived at Veterans Stadium for like 2 or 3 years in the 70s?
I did read the story, yeah. At first, I didn't believe it, but there's enough details in there that seem to make it at least make some sense, but yeah.
It sounds plausible. So anyway, look that up. Thank you again to Janine Schatz for joining us, and we appreciate you all listening as always. And thank you for indulging both Andrew and myself as we talk about our alma maters and their sports teams over these past few weeks. We will see you next time for the next episode of Hello Old Sports. Until then, I'm Dan Newman.
And I'm Andrew Newman. Goodbye, Old Sports.
This podcast is part of the Sports History Network, your headquarters for the yesteryear of your favorite sport. You can learn more at sportshistorynetwork.com.
We here at the Sports History Network proudly partner with 26 podcasts all revolving around the history of sports. But did you know that many of our hosts were sports history authors way before they started their shows? It's true. We've got Joe Ziemba, host of When Football Was Football, Joe Zagurski, host of Pro Football in the 1970s, Mark Morthier, host of Yesterday Sports, Tommy Phillips, host of Lombardi Memories, and Scott Adamson, co-host of From the 55-Yard Line. All these authors have many books for you to choose from. To check them out, go to our website at sportshistorynetwork.com/sportshistorybooks. Pick up your copy today. Soundtrack provided by Kevin MacLeod of filmmusic.io.